Part 2: The Korean War and Evacuation Life. The 38th parallel is the middle of the Korean peninsula. After the liberation of Korea on August 15, 1945, it passed outside Gaesong as a military demarcation line, and the southern part of the Korean peninsula became known as South Korea territory since then. After the Korean War, Gaesong became North Korean territory along the border. My parents got married in Gaesong before the war. In 1950, when my elder sister was born, the Korean War broke out. During the war, the enemy deployed MiG jet fighters that were made in the Soviet Union and bombarded Gaesong indiscriminately. When the MiG fighters appeared in the air, the sirens sounded and the residents evacuated to shelters. One day, a siren sounded to signal the evacuation at the appearance of the MiG fighter. My mother rushed to the air raid shelter with my sister on her back. At that time, shells from the MiG burst at the entrance of the shelter. Fortunately, my mother and sister were saved by a short distance. After liberation, my father joined the Daehan Cheongyeongdan Korea Youth Corps, a right-wing organization, as a young man. It was time for the nation to be divided into the left and the right after independence from Japan. Since the division of the two Koreas, there were many youth organizations in the South, and the Korean Youth Corps was organized by President Ri Sung-man. The purpose of the organization was patriotism, but some critics say it was created for the political purposes. It is said that there were 2 million members in the group. As Gaesong was divided by the 38th parallel and closer to North Korea, it seemed that there were still many conflicts between the left and the right. There was the Democratic Youth League as the left-wing youth organization. On June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded and Gaesong quickly became communist. As we know throughout history, many young men joined the North Korean army and became communist leaders. People with social discontentment or who had connections also joined the Communist Party. They were wearing armbands and harassing the residents, including the landlord class. During the war, it was said that the North Korean army, which occupied my mother's hometown, used her house as a local makeshift camp. Because my mother's house was the largest in town, they used it as a camp, and it became the seed of greater misery. Whenever North Korean soldiers came down during the war, they set up a regional headquarters at my mother's house. And when the South Korean troops advanced, they also used my mother's house as the regional headquarters for the Korean army. In such confusion, my grandfather could not do anything. His eldest son-in-law went to Pyongyang to take part in the revolution, and his daughter was always crying. My father joined the KLO guerrilla army with my uncle. As the UN forces fought in the Korean War, General MacArthur's 8240 Marine Corps organized a guerrilla unit gathering men who knew the local geography. The unit was called KLO, Korea Liaison Office. Young people belonging to the Korea Youth Corps applied for the KLO. My father was a member of the British Army at first, and after a few months belonged to the Wolfpack unit, a Ganghwa independent unit of the U.S. 8240 Marine Corps. My father used to say that he crossed the threshold of death several times by infiltrating an area that was at war with the enemy and carrying out reconnaissance missions. Once there was a movie named 8240 Marine Corps, which was a cinematic version of the KLO unit in the Icheon area. When I was young, most of the movies were about war, separation, poverty, and other sad stories. Before the recapture of Seoul during the Korean War, The KLO unit played a role as a guide in the Ichon amphibious landings which General MacArthur launched. It is said that the KLO unit in Ichon lit up the light of the Palmido Island lighthouse to allow the Allied warships to enter the port. The West Coast is a region where large ships, such as warships, are not allowed to access due to the wide gap between tides. Therefore, there were other opinions within the UN forces opposing the landing operations in Ichon because it was a gamble. The KLO unit, which was well informed about the local situation, was able to make the landing operations a success. The KLO unit in Genghua Island opened the way and allowed the British Army to land. The North Korean Army also gathered people who were well informed about the situation in the region and carried out the same type of tactics as the South Korean Army. In the end, the same local people fought for their lives. Although it was more than 60 years ago, the Ichon amphibious landings were historic military operations that could protect the Free Republic of Korea from communists. With the success of the Ichon amphibious landings, our troops recaptured Seoul and then advanced to Gaesong. However, in January of the following year, our troops began to retreat as a result of the advancing Chinese forces. The elders of both my father's and mother's family said they would stay in their hometown, and only the young people should leave for a while. My father's stepbrother did not join the evacuation route. My family crossed the mouth of the Han River by a wooden boat saved by my father from Gepung and came to Sanipo in Genghua Island near the mouth of the Han River. My father, mother, 3 sisters, and a nephew of my mother boarded the wooden boat together. Just like most refugees in that area, they crossed the Han River estuary by boat and escaped with nothing. When the war was over, they believed they would be able to meet their families again. But in the end, after 3 years of war, instead of the 38th parallel, the truce line was created, and Gaesong unfortunately became North Korean territory. My father was completely deprived of his youth because of the war. In the decades following the end of the war, he could not forget what happened at that time and always stayed alert. My uncle, my maternal aunt's husband, who went to the KLO with my father, died in a military hospital right after the war. As a result, my mother's elder sister lived alone for 60 years and had a difficult life. After the evacuation, my family stayed in Ganghwa and moved to Suwon where we had no connections. It was said that my father built a tent to be our potential home. There, my sister, who was 2 years older than me, was born in 1953, and I was born in the spring of 1955. There was no food to eat. My mother said that the farming land she left behind in her hometown and the food that had been plentiful before her eyes were now just memories. Sometimes my mother picked up the rice that was served outside the gate after Jessa, an ancestral rite, in the neighborhood. When my family was starving and had nothing to eat, my mother took my sisters to the orphanage with me on her back. She could breastfeed me, but she made the decision to go to the orphanage because she couldn't see her daughters starving to death. She left her 2 daughters at the orphanage, and she was heartbroken. My mother, who was more likely to die from the pain of parting from her children, ran to the orphanage the next morning to take her children back. On the way down from Ganghwa, my mother said she picked up a bundle on the road. My father was so weak that he couldn't even see it. When my mother opened it, it was a bundle of money. She was a pure woman, but she took some money out of it and bought a chicken. My father was able to recover his health and was able to see with his own eyes once he ate the chicken. My father gave half of the money to his elder brother without hesitation, and his elder brother became a police officer in Gunson, Jelabukto. With such a story, my father thought he could go to his brother's house and be equal with him. There was no job to make money. There was a shortage of food, so the evacuees had nothing to eat. My father led my family to his brother's house in Gunson. When we arrived at Gunson, my father's elder brother remarried there after the evacuation, and my elder aunt did not welcome us because they also lacked food. There, my second elder sister and I suffered from measles. One day, my elder aunt put out the fire to save the firewood in the fuel hole in the kitchen for the floor heating. My sister died then. My parents resented the death of my sister for their whole life, blaming my elder aunt for her death. I must have been strong in my health, and maybe I was immune because of my mother's milk. My family could not afford to mourn the separation of our family and the death of my sister due to the division of South and North Korea. It was more important than anything else to get a house and food to live. After the evacuation, my family did not starve to death without anything to depend on. But still, it was never easy to survive. In addition, the PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, from my father's life in the guerrilla camp would hurt my family even more.